I'm Bonnie Lin, Director of the ChinaPower Project and Senior Advisor at the Center for Strategic International Studies. In this episode of the ChinaPower Podcast, we're discussing China's ambitions in the polar regions. Despite the vast distances separating China from the Arctic and the Antarctic regions, China has set its sights on being a polar power. What are China's interests in these remote frontiers, and how is China pursuing its goals there? How do China's commercial and scientific ventures help to advance Beijing's diplomatic and strategic objectives in the polar regions? Here to discuss these questions and more are two of my CSIS colleagues, Dr. Matthew Funaiole and Mr. Brian Hart. Matthew is Vice President of the Ideas Lab, Andreas C. Dracopoulos Chair in Innovation, and Senior Fellow in the ChinaPower Project at CSIS. He specializes in using data-driven research to address complex policy issues with a focus on Chinese foreign policy, dual-use technology, and maritime trade. In 2022, he launched the Hidden Reach initiative, which leverages open-source intelligence to uncover poorly understood sources of Chinese influence and examine how China advances its strategic interests through commercial and scientific ventures. Brian is Deputy Director and Fellow of the ChinaPower Project, where his research focuses on Chinese foreign and security policy, China's military and defense industrial base, Taiwan security issues, and U.S.-China relations. He also helps lead the Hidden Reach initiative. Matthew and Brian, thank you so much for joining me today. I know you've both been using satellite imagery and other open source methods to track China's activities around the world, including looking at China's activities in the polar regions. And you recently also published analysis of China's construction of a brand new research station in Antarctica. So let's just jump right in. What exactly is going on at China's newest Antarctica outpost? And why does it matter for the rest of the world?
Well, thanks, Bonnie, for having us back on the podcast. It's always fun to rejoin the podcast and dive deep into some of these issues on China. To answer your question, maybe take a step back quickly and then dive in. I think that it can be easy to lose sight of, how far China's global ambitions reach, especially when people are hyper-focused on hotspots like Taiwan, which is certainly the case in DC and for good reason. But at the same time, Beijing has cast a pretty wide net in efforts to try and broaden its influence. And it does so sort of these incremental and sometimes subtle ways, sometimes using unexpected approaches that don't always grab headlines. And because of that, there's just this general lack of transparency around a lot of issues, including what's going on in the polar regions. And that creates ambiguity. Sometimes that ambiguity is intentionally created, but that all adds up to there being just complicating efforts by the U.S. to formulate effective policy. And that's why, we spent the last 2.5 years looking at the polar regions, using a variety of open source tools to try to gain some clarity into what's going on there. For our last report, we leveraged a number of different tools. We used satellite imagery. We used synthetic aperture radar. We also paired in some AIS shipping tracking data so we could kind of see what the activity looked like. And that's helped us to get a good sense of how construction is progressing at China's 5th research station. And this will be its 3rd year-round facility on the continent. And it's pretty significant in terms of size. You can see it in the imagery. I'd urge people to go out and check out the imagery that we released. It's going to be able to host around 80 personnel during summer, another 30 in winter, which is going to go a long way in closing the gap between China and some of the more established countries that have a prolonged presence in Antarctica. So that's on one side of it. I think in terms of what we need to be mindful about, I'll turn it over to Brian to talk a little bit about the dual use technology that we've been able to track being used by China, both at this station but elsewhere in Antarctica.
Yeah, thanks, Matthew. And thanks, Bonnie, for having us. So this station that we're looking at, Qinling Station, is China's 3rd permanent station and 5th station overall. Some of the stations aren't open year round due to the harsh weather and climate in Antarctica. So this will be one of the bigger stations there. And if you look at kind of a map of Antarctica, you can see that China really strategically triangulated this station to be with its other stations to kind of increase the overall coverage and fill gaps in the coverage that they had there. And the idea is that they'll be able to get, at least according to the reports that they put out, a couple of 100 miles of range in terms of the kind of activities, research activities that they can cover from that station. And, there's a lot of genuine science going on here. The official descriptions of the station are that it'll work on, ocean and climate research, even some space physics and things like that. So a lot of different scientific operations going on at this facility. But what we really honed in on are what some of the inherent capabilities are there that could be dual use. And so we really talk about how the plan to build a satellite ground station there will be one of the most significant opportunities for China to potentially leverage the capabilities there for dual purposes, for, yes, scientific and civilian purposes, but perhaps also military and intelligence gathering capabilities. So, ground stations are used around the world to be able to track satellites in space and to be able to communicate with those satellites. And China does have a growing constellation of scientific observation satellites that would be communicating with this station. And so that's all very legitimate. But we talk about in this recent report and in a previous report that we did a few years ago about how those can be leveraged for dual use purposes. And so that's really kind of the gist of this, and just the thing that we flag that needs to be, kept an eye on as we move forward. I think when we looked at the satellite imagery most recently, China they had not completed construction on the satellite ground station yet. So that's something that I think we'll be watching going forward as the work on this facility continues in the coming years.
And maybe just to back up a little bit, why does China care about the polar regions? What are China's main interests there? And how do they differ between the Arctic and Antarctica? And then I also have a couple of other follow-on questions about the particular station, but maybe let's look at the strategic level first.
I can jump in here. So, China's interests in both polar regions overlap with what we see elsewhere in other domains like deep sea exploration and outer space. These are these kind of emerging domains. They are of geopolitical and strategic importance and economic importance. And China is actively seeking to insert itself into these areas. And then when opportunity arises, start to assert its interests. When it comes to the Arctic, the sort of best insights we really have come from the 2018 white paper on Arctic policy, which laid out some of the core principles of what China is trying to do there, which overlap quite a bit with what it's aiming to do in Antarctica. It also gave us one of my favorite concepts ever, the near Arctic state concept, right? If you look at a globe of the world, China is not an Arctic state. It doesn't have the proximity. It doesn't have the sovereignty claims in the Arctic. So it had to invent this term for itself, being a near Arctic state, which is very creative. But more importantly, the white paper sort of lays out these four overlapping areas of interest. And the first two are what people oftentimes are talking about when they think about both polar spaces, right? The first is scientific, right? So Brian kind of mentioned this earlier, studying things like climate change, using it for communication with satellites. It's also a testing ground for different types of equipment and platforms that operate in extreme environments. With the Arctic, too, there's quite a bit of surveying for resources. Now, the second bucket's that's scientific. The second bucket's commercial. Again, the one that probably gets talked about quite a bit when it comes to the Arctic. So this could be natural resource extraction, things tied into the Northern Sea Route, right? So part of the Polar Silk Road, taking advantage of melting ice to shorten the maritime path between China and Europe by 10, 11 days, which would ideally shorten shorter times mean less cost. So there could be some savings there. And then there's also two other sort of areas as well, the strategic and the diplomatic area that kind of build on these two, right? On the strategic side, you have an effort to secure China's maritime interests. If you have a new sea route, you're going to have to secure that sea route. And it's possible that the Arctic could also be a future operational environment for the Chinese military. That's not really there yet. It's more the sort of intelligence collection phase, but there is a strategic aspect to it. And then all of these kind of build up to having low influence over the regional governance structure, which is part of the diplomatic objective that China has laid out.
A lot of the same interests that I just outlined a minute ago with regard to the Arctic also apply to Antarctica, albeit with some caveats. The core interests are similar. China wants to shape the environment and do so in such a way that it can maximize its influence over the region. But there are some key differences, and those are mostly shaped by the unique features of Antarctica. There is a much more structured international legal framework governing Antarctica, and that does shape how China approaches the continent. The Antarctic Treaty System, which includes agreements like the 1959 Antarctic Treaty and the 1991 Protocol on Environmental Protection, they place pretty strict limits on what countries can do on the continent, and it definitely mandates, that Antarctica is for peaceful use, and it promotes things like scientific research. And these rules really shape everything, right? They shape everything from the construction of stations to exploration to environmental research projects and help to put into place environmental protections. And things like military activities and resource extractions are specifically prohibited under the Antarctic Treaty System. And there are systems in place to help ensure that countries are compliant with those parameters. There's always a possibility that China might seek to try and change those rules down the road. That's something it really couldn't do for a few decades. It'd be pretty hard to do. It's a high threshold to try to reopen things to negotiation. But what we have seen is there evidence that China does want to try and find some ways to assert itself within those parameters. One of those is, working with partners. We've seen over the past several years China building up its partnerships with countries like Thailand, for instance, which wants to be involved in Antarctic research but lacks their own infrastructure there to be able to do so. And so they started doing joint projects together in 2016, and then in 2022 they actually set up a joint research lab at the Great Wall Station for Thai scientists and for Chinese scientists to be able to use. And it's really, that kind of long-term thinking that we see with China inserting itself into both of the polar regions. But again, the way in which they engage is complex, right? And there are nuances to both of them, and there are restrictions on both of them. In the Arctic, right, it has sovereignty divisions, so there's less room for China to maneuver, and it gets back to that point I made earlier about China having to declare itself as a near-Arctic state in order to be able to do that. And then in Antarctica, you have a more strict legal structure, right, and it's further away, which adds certain logistical complications to things as well. So there's differences in how China acts. Some of the objectives overlap pretty significantly, but where we really see it making inroads is that scientific research, that scientific footprint in both regions, which helps to open the door for other types of activities, for China having a seat at the table, and ultimately both securing its interests and helping to shape the region more broadly. And again, we see that elsewhere as well in other domains that China is engaged in.
Yeah, and I'll just add on to that. One kind of conceptual framework that I think is important to point out is just how the polar regions fit into China's broader thinking about some of these frontier kind of areas. So we've seen Chinese scholars and documents referring to new strategic frontiers. These are what Chinese thinkers kind of conceptualize as spaces that are open to kind of competition. They're not dominated by any one player necessarily, and they're not dominated by like sovereignty claims. So these are things like the polar regions, but also deep sea areas and the sea floor, as well as cyberspace and outer space. So again, areas where China sees opportunities to maybe make gains, especially vis-a-vis the United States in some of these areas that are not traditionally governed in the same ways as, regular governed spaces. And so China sees opportunities to leapfrog and to grow its influence in those regions. And I think we've seen them make a lot of gains in those areas, and there's some interplay between the different areas. For example, a lot of the capabilities that China is fielding to conduct underwater research in deep seas can also be applied to the Arctic. So China is obviously making a lot of headway in areas like unmanned underwater vehicles, as well as UAVs too. So they're kind of thinking about these things in connected ways and seeing how they can make inroads and advance their interest and use that to then shape some of the rulemaking and norm setting and agenda setting in these places going forward. And I think that they see these as places that'll be particularly important as we go forward and as new technologies come online. And again, China really wants to be ahead of that space.
And just circling back to China's newest station in Antarctica, Matthew, you mentioned that it is able to house 80 personnel in the summer, 30 in the winter. And then Brian, you mentioned that some of these stations also may have satellite ground stations. So how big is this most recent one? And what is the scope and scale of this new station?
I can kind of get started digging in. So I have to check the exact numbers, but I feel like China's previous research stations have around, maximum of 60 personnel there at, under optimal conditions. Those numbers tend to go down in winter because they more resources and it's a little bit more difficult to operate. But the bigger picture is more the coverage, right? And Brian Brian kind of mentioned this coverage. Right now, if you kind of like added up all of the different stations that are in Antarctica and you looked at the capacity of all of them, the top 10 list might surprise people in terms of the amount of research personnel that they're able to have there. I mean, the U.S. is at the top of it, which probably doesn't surprise very many people. But China's like midway down in the top of the list. So you have countries like Argentina and Chile and the UK and France and Australia all having greater capacity for researchers on the continent. Now, that doesn't mean that all those facilities are equal. Some of them are older. Some of them don't have as sophisticated technology. So I really think it's a two-pronged approach for China, right? It's expand so that you can have more researchers physically there, but then also upgrade it with some advanced technology, which I think can lead into answering that second part. And Brian, I'll let you jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a good reminder of, again, that China was kind of starting from a place well behind some of these established powers in the region, like the United States, that have been an active player for decades. So China is trying to catch up, both in terms of the number and types of expeditions and research work that they can do in Antarctica, but also just in terms of their physical footprint. Because the region is so remote and hard to access, having a physical footprint is really crucial to being able to operate there. And I think it also has a big impact on, states' ability to shape the rules there. Because if you're not physically present there, it's hard to make the case that you should be, shaping the governing structures or the rules that are at play there. So that's a big part of this. So I think that in addition to obviously the concrete capabilities that this new station adds, it certainly adds a little bit of geopolitical heft and weight behind China's ability to speak to the future of the region. And I think that that's a big part of it. It's a bit of a status symbol as well.
The status part, I think, is important, right? Because you definitely see this sort of anxiety about being on the outside looking in and trying to insert and assert your interest in places where the governance structure was put into play well before you were able to actually be at the table. And that very much is the case in Antarctica, where China is in this sort of catch up, right? Like how can it be in a place to be an influential stakeholder and be seen as a legitimate actor? I mean, getting back to the kind of joke I made earlier, the whole near Arctic thing, right? That is an effort to try to establish legitimacy, right? To say that we should be allowed to be a major actor here, even though we are not actually an Arctic state. So I do think the prestige part comes into play quite a bit.
And just to make sure I'm understanding where China fits in among all the other actors that might be operating either in the Arctic or Antarctica. It seems, Matthew, what you were saying is, as well as Brian, China is expanding its presence there, but it's not yet one of the top players, both in terms of activities or presence in either region. Is that correct?
You probably have to take them separately. I think that it's a little bit more behind in Antarctica than it is in the Arctic. And that's just partially a distance thing and partially a time component of it. I mean, a lot of the, outposts that are in Antarctica were set up in like the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. And so there is just more history going on there. Whereas I think, Brian, if you remember, Great Wall was set up in like 1985 or like mid 80s, right? That was its first sort of foray into Antarctic research. So behind, yes, in the sense of having a prolonged presence, and that helps to build institutional knowledge, and that helps to facilitate research, right? Research in all these places is just one-off, right? It's, building on what has been, done before. And so there's definitely a catch-up aspect to it. It has historically had less partners in some of these places as well, right? It sort of had a period where it was starting to become more active in partnerships with countries, but then as, last decade or so, kind of pushed to the side. And so it has to do a lot of this research itself. I would say in the Arctic, it's a little bit different. China, because of proximity and because it's easier for China to get to it, they really have become one of the more dominant players there, especially when it comes to maritime shipping and icebreaker activity. I think that China and Russia are probably the two most active states when it comes to the actual maritime shipping aspect of the Arctic. And that is definitely something that China has put a premium on.
Okay, great. Thank you, Matthew. I know Brian and Matthew, you both talked about how China has been growing its presence in the region. How is China doing so? And Brian, you mentioned opportunities. What opportunities is China seizing to be able to operate in the region?
Yeah, I mean, this is a big part about how China thinks about operating in areas, especially further away from China itself, right? As Brian put it, in these new strategic frontier areas. For both regions, really, it's about building up presence over time. I had mentioned 4 buckets above, the scientific and the commercial being the first two. those are how you establish a foothold. We certainly see scientific missions both in the Arctic and Antarctica being at the forefront of how China establishes itself, whether that is in the Arctic from its two permanent research bases, the one that it has in Norway and the one that it has in Iceland, or at the base that we've been tracking in Antarctica, or some of the previous things it's done, like setting up a part-time research outpost at Dome A back in 2009, which is the highest ice dome on the Antarctic plateau, which is one of those things that China was really excited to be able to go out there and do. And so it's this idea that there's a lot to explore and there's a lot of science to be done. And, Chinese scientists are really, at the forefront of some of these areas. But over time, science, and then at least in the Arctic, the commercial helps to build that presence, which gives China the right to speak, right? That's what Chinese officials argue is okay, we're here. We're conducting research. We're conducting missions. We have a right to speak on affairs in these regions. And that's doubly pronounced in the Arctic, where you see China pouring billions of dollars into energy and mining infrastructure investment projects across the region. Most of it these days being concentrated in Russia. But the idea is really just, how do we become an influential stakeholder over time? How do we become more increasingly perceived as a legitimate actor? And then how do we use that presence to shape the environment in such a way that's beneficial to our interests? Maybe last point there, and then I'll pivot over to Brian. I mean, where institutions and governance structures are malleable, China definitely is seeking to try to shift the rules of behavior, right? And shift the norms in a way that works in its benefits. And we've seen China becoming increasingly involved in some of the UN technical organizations, something like the International Maritime Organization, which helps to set the rules for international shipping and kind of sets standards, but China wants to tweak those standards so they're beneficial to its preferences. It's been in the Arctic specifically pushing to kind of reclass the requirements for the kind of ships that can enter into that domain, which, it can be dangerous, right? Because we're trying to lessen the restrictions, which means that the hulls of the vessels that are traveling up there might not be strengthened in such a way to actually be able to break through ice, which could lead to some safety considerations down the line. And where it has been unsuccessful in trying to change the rules, it's just been ignoring them. I mean, last year we had a number of different cases of Chinese vessels just completely violating the safety of navigation rules that are in place by sending up vessels that don't have an ice class designation, which again, nothing's happened, nothing really yet, but that could lead to some pretty serious problems down the line, especially if they're carrying energy. So you just have this instance where push its interests, try to tweak things, and if that doesn't work, circumvent or undermine the existing frameworks that are in place.
Yeah, and so Matthew just laid out a lot of the commercial and scientific efforts that China's doing in these regions. And what we talk about in some of our work and have been looking at a lot is the extent to which China is or can use these capabilities to also support strategic and potentially military and intelligence gathering efforts. Like we said at the start, China will have dual use capabilities at Chinling Station in Antarctica and also at some of its other Antarctic stations. And this has been the case in the Arctic as well. In 2020, the Swedish Space Corporation actually decided to not renew a contract with China for China to be able to access scientific station in Kiruna, Sweden. And the reason that the Swedish Space Corporation decided to do that was over concerns that China may be using it to achieve some of those military and intelligence gathering efforts. And so, again, we see evidence of China thinking about this and wanting to do this in both of these regions in terms of collecting intelligence, signals intelligence, and other kinds. And I think the important thing to keep in mind here is to think about, like what China may be using this for. Because I think one broad takeaway that we've found from a lot of our work is that China really is expanding its strategic periphery to be much more global, looking outside of its neighborhood in Asia to expand its reach. And that takes work. There's big gaps in where China has a presence. And so because China doesn't have territory in the Arctic or the Antarctic in the same way that the United States and Russia and Canada have Arctic territories, China's had to find other options and to kind of fill those gaps. And so they think about this in a kind of a systems of systems way, so that if, even as they're collecting data across all these avenues, across scientific measures, if it can fit into, data patterns that will help support the PLA, for example, to be able to operate naval vessels in some of these waters where they're not familiar. That can feed into that broader system and inform them. And so that's where they're looking for opportunities to kind of maximize these scientific ventures to support that. And of course, the U.S. Defense Department has said that China does this. It has said that, China's scientific ventures in the Arctic are supporting these dual use capabilities. And then most recently this year in the Defense Department's 2024 report echoed the same claims that we've been making through our research, which is that this new Chinling station in Antarctica will also be able to do the same thing in terms of supporting dual use military and intelligence gathering objectives. So, of course, DoD is saying that too, but it's important to really highlight here that it's not just us saying this. I mean, the PRC thinkers and writers are saying this as well. I mean, I think one of the more telling examples of that is the 2020 version of the Science and Military Strategy, which is one of the more authoritative Chinese resources that we have access to in the open source. It has this following quote, which I'll read, is military-civilian mixing is the main way for great powers to achieve a polar military presence. And China should give full play to the role of military forces in supporting polar scientific research and other operations. So, I mean, I think just in clear terms, that's what these Chinese thinkers and strategists are saying themselves. So this isn't just us, hypothesizing of what China could do. We know that they're thinking about this, and they're trying to find ways to, as they build their presence in these areas, to maximize that to whatever strategic ends they can.
One final thing I'll add here is that all of this is taking place within the backdrop of China's military-civil fusion strategy, which is a national level strategy to really blend together China's national security and economic development strategies to make them work together and to simultaneously support each other. And, there are analogs to military-civil fusion in other countries. The United States, of course, has long benefited from spin-on and spin-off technologies. Think of things like DARPA, where you invest in exploring technologies that can have both commercial and military applications. But I think China's MCS strategy goes significantly further again in terms of making this a national level strategy to really support both economic and national security goals at a very high level. And this isn't something Beijing is just doing in passing. Xi Jinping has anointed himself the chair of the Communist Party's Military Civil Fusion Central Commission. And so, again, when Xi Jinping imprints his own, kind of stamp on things like this, it's a very clear symbol that it's something very important. And that's something we've seen him give priority to during his tenure as he tries to modernize the Chinese military, but also to advance China's broader national security goals. And so I think when you put that in the context of what China's doing in the Arctic, you can really see that China has an interest and kind of a history of trying to blend these commercial and civilian activities to support the Chinese military and other strategic efforts.
And you've talked a little bit about this already, including U.S. concerns of China's activities. But what has the reception been to China's deeper engagement in each of these areas? Has China generally faced any obstacles or pushback in its effort to expand? And Matthew, you mentioned that China's worked closely with Russia in the Arctic. As you look at China's operations in both the Arctic and Antarctica, what are the closest partners China has in each region?
Yeah, I mean, this is where the external environment really impacts the way in which China can pursue some of its interests. You can take a couple steps back to go back a few years. You could definitely see China was trying to have a lot of partners, especially in the Arctic, right? It needs a partner in the Arctic because it isn't really an Arctic state, but it courted a lot of different countries, including, NATO allies, in terms of trying to set up research partnerships, trying to set up research bases. But, as Brian mentioned with the case with the Swedish Space Corporation and the operation of ground station at Kiruna, there's been, quite a lot of pushback, and the geopolitical environment has changed, right? There's growing concerns about what China's ultimate interests are, the way in which dual-use technology comes into play, which is tricky, right? Because we're getting to the point where like almost any technology can be dual use, but when you don't have transparency into what the data stream is, right? Scientists collecting it here, getting sent back to China, how's it ultimately getting used? You just start to have this increasing level of concern, and then you add on top of that, the geopolitical environment in Europe, right? There's certainly been backlash as a result of China's support for Russia in the war of Ukraine. China has been upset about Finland and Sweden's ascension to NATO, right? Talking about how it escalates regional tensions. And so you definitely have this, in the Arctic specifically, kind of this bifurcation of who's doing what, right? And China is increasingly turning to Russia as its partner of choice, especially when it comes to investments, pouring, millions, hundreds of millions of dollars into Russian energy projects and other types of projects as well, port infrastructure being one that really stands out. But the point I kind of want to make on that is that that's been part of China's long-term thinking for a while, right? It was exploring these research opportunities, but it's back as far as like 2019, the Chinese Academy of Science put out a report where it had gone out and examined the Russian ports that it thought would be most beneficial for its strategic interests along the Northern Sea route. I'm not sure the Russians were super happy and excited about that kind of assessment, but certainly something they've been looking at for quite some time. There's also been movement on the political front with both Xi and Putin expressing optimism about their sort of ongoing partnerships in the region. But I'll let Brian jump in here because I know he's been following the China-Russia angle and can talk a little bit more detail about the type of cooperation that's been happening, especially in the Arctic.
Yeah, I mean, of course, we could talk for hours about China-Russia relations as its own thing, but I do want to touch on a couple of things here, which is that, of course, we've seen, strategic convergence between Beijing and Moscow since Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. And I think a lot of that is driven at the high level by Xi Jinping and Putin personally. And so, but you will see occasionally developments on the Arctic do make it their way into these conversations, which I think is a sign of continued cooperation and dialogue on these areas. I think there's some areas of tensions that I'll touch on, but I do think we see signs of steady progress. I mean, just last year, China and Russia agreed to promote safe maritime traffic on the Northern Sea route, which is one of the routes that goes through the Arctic and would be an important way for China to get goods shipped from Europe and Russia into Chinese ports. So that's a joint area that they're working together on and making progress on. I think one of the other really big things that we've seen recently is that the two countries signed a Coast Guard maritime law enforcement cooperation agreement. And then in 2024, we actually saw, just a couple of months ago, we saw them do their first ever joint Coast Guard patrol in the Arctic. And that also follows on just a few months before that. China and Russia also did a joint strategic aerial patrol in which their aircraft flew into the air defense identification zone, off the coast of Alaska. So we are seeing the two countries cooperate a lot in the maritime and airspace domains in this region, kind of near the high north. And we're seeing that grow pretty quickly, I think, in a lot of concrete ways. And so I think, again, clear sign that they're interested in working together, I think, especially in ways that maybe challenge the United States and its presence there. But I will say, I do think that there are some reasons that Moscow may be hesitant on some of these fronts. I mean, the Arctic has long been something that Moscow covets as its own strategic, perimeter and an area where it wants to really hold a lot of sway and where it does face, some competition in terms of governance and things like that with the United States and many of the other Arctic powers being NATO countries. So I think Russia sees it as a space that it wants to continue to have a lot of sway in. Russia has a lot of sensitive equipment and facilities up there, ballistic missile submarines and things like that they operate that are strategically sensitive. And so even though there's this increasingly or close partnership between China and Moscow across a lot of fronts, I do think that Moscow will be still pretty sensitive to what it sees as encroachments on its strategic space. So I think that there's some pressure from them to increase cooperation, but to do it on their own terms as much as they can.
Yeah, I can jump in quickly at the end there. I mean, I think that there's certainly growing convergence in area, but that doesn't mean that there's not tension between the two sides, right? And, Brian, you kind of mentioned that here. It can be easy to misconstrue the partnership between the two countries, in a way that we kind of think about NATO and how alliances work in the American context. But, you certainly have negotiations and tension there, even between countries that are working together in a lot of different spaces. And there's been, some fair amount of hardball back and forth with the, Power of Siberia 2 pipeline and things like that. And a couple of years ago, you had, I think it was the Russian, I can't remember exactly what it was, but Russian prosecutors ended up charging a Russian Arctic expert with treason because they were passing classified information to China. And so they still have stuff that they can cause tension between the two of them. But for a variety of reasons, they're being pushed together. And also the balance of power between the two has changed, maybe from, you look 10 years ago when we started to see the partnership emerge in some of these emerging domains. Things look a little bit different today than they did then.
And just to follow up, so what countries does China partner with in Antarctica? You mentioned Arctic partnering with Russia, but what are the countries that China works with in Antarctica?
Yeah, this is where the environment tends to be a little bit different because there isn't the pronounced sovereignty issues that there are in the Arctic and Antarctica. So China has had a little bit more success with countries that it partners with there. And some of them are countries that don't have access on their own to the region. And so I mentioned Thailand earlier. That's been one of the sort of more pronounced places where you've seen partnership between the two countries that's kind of accumulated in this joint research center that they now operate. There's any number of other missions that Chinese researchers are sometimes attached to. So research missions with a lot of the global south that have a strong presence there. And there has been, collaborative efforts between China on these sort of research fronts. So there's again, this kind of push toward where is there the opportunity for partnership. Global south countries that don't have access to the Antarctic on their own. That's really where you see China pushing its partnerships. It doesn't mean it doesn't, try to work with states like Australia or the European powers, but there's just this increasing tension over that. And so they're not happening as much anymore.
Great. Thank you, Matthew. A final question for both of you is, how worried should the United States and our allies and partners be about China's ambitions and activities in these two regions? And it seems like what you're saying is there should be differing levels of concern about Chinese activities with Russia in the Arctic versus Chinese activities in the Antarctica. But would love your thoughts on this question.
Yeah, I'll jump in here with a few thoughts on level of concerns, and then I'll turn over to Matthew maybe to talk about what specific steps we can take. I do think it's important to take a quick step back here at the end as we think through things and just point out that, for Xi Jinping, he's not waking up every day thinking about what China needs to be doing in the Arctic or the Antarctic. I don't think it's at the top of his priority list. Obviously, matters closer to home like Taiwan, the South China Sea, domestic security and domestic politics. I think that those are the things that keep Chinese leaders up at night. But I do think, again, I think it's important to think about how China fits the polar regions into their broader ambitions. And it ultimately comes back to, again, extending their strategic periphery, getting a better sense of what's going on in the world so that they can make some of these concrete gains in places. And I think really a lot of it goes back to this issue of where they can see places that are maybe not as contested. Obviously, things like Taiwan are extremely contested and have long, complex histories that put them kind of front to front with other great powers like the United States. But Antarctica is a place where they can, and the Arctic are places where they can potentially make more subtler influence gains under the radar. And so I think that's really the kind of framing that I would put here. And I do think that it is important too to think about the economic implications here. Of course, as Matthew has said, China has a lot of interest in energy resources and shipping through the Arctic. And in the Antarctic, there are significant protections. But I think one of the things that we, again, have to worry about from a global governance perspective is how China's interests may conflict with ours and what steps we can take to work with our allies and partners to reduce China's ability to erode some of those norms, especially around things like mineral extraction in Antarctica. Obviously, as the climate shifts, there may be new opportunities that China pushes for mineral extraction, for resource extraction. And those are things that I think the United States should have a voice on and wants to have a voice on. And so it really comes down to pushing back against China and pushing for transparency where we can. But I'll let Matthew touch on some more specifics.
No, I think that's great. I'll be brief and sort of give just a few closing thoughts here. The most important thing for DC, for Washington to do, right, is focus on evidence-based evaluations of China's capabilities and its intentions rather than assumptions and rhetoric. And that, unfortunately, is harder said than actually done, right? And the work that we're all doing at CSIS, the sort of open source community, we can help provide some insights on that into what's going on with infrastructure developments and fleet developments and on the ground activity. To just put really, really be very blunt about what something Brian said earlier. Not every Chinese scientist is secretly working for the PLA, right? And I feel like we've gotten to the point now where we're just looking at it and saying, well, China's there, everything they're doing is bad. Some of the things that we need scientific research on really do require lots of collaboration and partnership, right? If we're going to, try to mitigate the worst effects of climate change, it's good to have Chinese scientists who are some of the leading scientists in the world working on some of these issues. So we really do have to assess the actual threat. Other things, that are significant for the U.S. to really think about, continue to strengthen partnerships in both regions, right? Working closely with our established partners and with some new partners, and specifically using those partnerships to reinforce existing frameworks, things like the Antarctic Treaty System, right? Making sure that we continue to do everything we can to uphold the principles of transparency. The other is you don't cede the scientific high ground, right? Continue to invest our presence in these regions, continue to invest in science and research. We should commit funding to scientific missions, to modernizing our existing facilities, seeing how we can work with partners to do things like enhanced logistical support, which might not sound like the most interesting and exciting thing in the world, but when you're in the furthest reaches of the planet, you really do need to kind of think about those things and how they maintain sustained presence in those areas. So, it kind of, closing the sort of podcast out and the thinking out is, yes, there are things that we need to be concerned about, but we need to be clear-eyed about what we can do, what the problems are, and the ways in which we can work with allies and partners to assure that principles of transparency remain in place, and that we're doing everything that we can to ensure environmental protection in these regions as well.
Great. Thank you very much, Matthew and Brian. So much food for thought. And again, thank you for focusing on a remote polar region that does not get as much attention as needed in the DC policy space. Thank you both for joining me today.
Thanks, Bonnie. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Bonnie.